Jason, buddy boy, thanks for coming out.
My pleasure.
So, where do we start? Are you from New York originally?
No.
Where are you from?
I grew up in a small town in Connecticut.
Really?
Northwest of...
Small town guy.
Northwest of Hartford.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, how long... You spent a long time in the city.
Yeah, I was in New York City for about 21 years.
Yeah. So, where did you get your start? Just like set the stage for everybody.
Yeah.
Professionally.
Yeah.
Where did it begin for you?
Yeah, I have quite a convoluted, interesting life story, and kind of how I got into all this and health and wellness. So I went to school in Philadelphia,
Okay.
and was an athlete in college. Always thought I was really healthy. I was a Division I athlete, and then I went straight to a hedge fund in 1998 before people knew what hedge funds were.
Yeah.
Always wanted to be an investor and, was probably too obsessed with the whole money game back then. And in my first couple years of working, I had this really interesting dichotomy happen, which was I was very successful in my first couple years of working, but I also got very sick. And I started developing these bizarre diseases. This is back in the year 2000, 2001, when functional medicine was still in its nascency. People didn't really think about root causes. And I started developing psoriasis all over my body. Okay. I had, my hair was falling out in clumps when I was in the shower. Like literally I'd see like clumps of hair.
It's alopecia areata.
I had tremendous brain fog, and what ended up really being the kind of nail in the coffin for me was I started going blind. And
wow, Jason, I didn't know this.
Yeah.
None of this.
Yeah. This is the major part of my story.
Yeah.
And it was really hard for me because I was just made the youngest partner in history at my firm. I was doing what I thought was the equivalent of winning. And I was ashamed of talking about how sick I was. Because I wanted to kind of give off this air of like success and being like the hero I always wished I could be. And I had a complicated childhood, and I had a lot of deep insecurities. And I had developed kind of this like incredible workaholism, productivity approach that I had developed in college, that allowed me to do very well in college, and it allowed me to do very well early in business. But what I didn't realize I was doing was I was literally killing myself.
Yeah.
And I went to the doctor. I saw several ophthalmologists, and they diagnosed me with a degenerative eye disease for which there's no cure, and said I would be fully blind by the age of 30. And I fell into a deep depression. I hid it from everybody. I didn't even tell my parents the extent of how bad my eye disease was.
Okay.
I saw a bunch of doctors for second and third opinions. Everyone had the same opinion of what I had. And I had to put my name on a corneal transplant list, which at that time, they didn't even know if that would work. And they told me I would be fully blind by the age of 30. And it was a horrific period for me.
Yes.
And, I was trained kind of as an empirical scientist. My first job was as a research data scientist. Back then, they didn't call it a data scientist. It was called a quantitative analyst. But everything for me back then was all about data. Data. It has to be, the data has to be there. You have to be able to prove it. And despite this training, I kind of knew something was wrong. Because even though I saw 5, 6, 7 different doctors, I had all these different diseases, all these different diagnoses, and they all wanted to give me different pills and different things for the various diseases. And I kind of knew instinctively, and I knew instinctively that there's no way all of these diseases weren't linked. Like it all came out in a period of 9 months.
Yeah.
And in college, I was very healthy, and I couldn't imagine how this happened. And, in terms of like work-life balance, I was working probably 90, 100 hours a week. I was eating like shit. I wasn't exercising anymore. I wasn't sleeping much. The whole like 23-year-old investment banker lifestyle I was doing.
Yeah.
And I decided to go into some really weird rabbit holes of research on my own around ancestral diets and around indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
And what I found, and originally the sort of course of why I was doing this research was because I was trying to first cure my psoriasis. And I had found some obscure research that linked atopic skin diseases with this particular eye disease that I had. It didn't say that it was causal, but there was a correlation.
Yeah.
And I sort of developed this naive hypothesis that if I could cure my skin diseases, then maybe my eye disease would go away, even though all the doctors said it was impossible.
Yeah.
And what I found with the ancestral diets, and particularly the indigenous peoples that I studied, and I didn't know much about nutrition at this point. I just was like desperate and sick. And what I found was that all of these different indigenous peoples had none of our modern chronic diseases. And, they didn't have diabetes, they didn't have heart disease, they didn't have obesity. And there was also like almost no recorded incidence of allergies, and ADHD and autism and these sort of things. And I got very curious because some of these indigenous peoples and hunter-gatherer type peoples that modern Americans would view almost as like cavemen.
Yeah, like the Hadza tribe.
Yeah. And the Maasai. And many tribes all over the country.
Even today, for people that don't know, they're still living like this.
Yeah, they still live like that.
Yeah.
But I had also heard about like the debates between carnivore and vegan. And what was amazing about these indigenous peoples is that depending on where they lived, they had totally different diets. Like if you were in the Arctic or you were in Alaska, you were living off of blubber and meat, and there were no fruits and vegetables, and they didn't have our modern diseases. And then the Maasai lives off of like cow blood and dairy and flesh and meat. And then there were other tribes that were fruits and nuts and seeds, and the only common thread amongst all these peoples was they ate very close to the earth. And they had a lot of other features to their lifestyle, which was also consistent with the blue zones, which was starting to become popularized back then, of community, of downtime, of laughter, of faith. And I started getting very intrigued because this wasn't easily provable, right? This wasn't like in modern science. There wasn't a lot of research papers on them because they certainly wouldn't be subjected to like clinical controlled studies. And I decided to see if I could cure my diseases going with an ancestral diet and changing my lifestyle. I told my ophthalmologist that I was going to do this, and he said, you're a fool. It's not going to work. But go ahead. And I started doing it, and I noticed my skin diseases started going away and my hair stopped falling out. And I noticed my vision started coming back. And thankfully, there's an objective test for this disease where they can measure if the disease is there or not for your eyes. Many months later, I went back in and I could see clearly. And I said, you have to give me that test because I think my vision's back. And he's like, that's impossible. And he gave me the test and it was gone. And you have those moments in your life where you remember it forever. Yeah. And he called over one of his colleagues, and this guy was an obnoxious Park Avenue, arrogant ophthalmologist. Yeah. And he called over this guy, his colleague, and he goes, you gotta look at this. And the guy goes, that's impossible. And then he comes over to me and he says, what did you do? And I told him, and he said, nah, I must have misdiagnosed you, is what he said.
He had to take the blame.
Yeah. Right? And, I'm at this point, I'm 24 years old. And I walk out of the office.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking it was like it was a divine intervention from God.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, I am never going to trust Western medicine dogma again. I am going to think for myself. Obviously, there's many positives to Western medicine, but this, like, if I just listened to them, I'd be blind. And I had something in my head, some voice that intervened and said, Jason, there's another way.
Yeah.
And from that moment, I decided I was going to spend a significant amount of my time to help people wake up, to help people realize what's wrong with the modern system.
Yeah.
I learned later, many years later, that I have a few, let's just call them genetic abnormalities where I don't detoxify properly.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of like a canary in the coal mine And my life up until that point was actually, despite my financial success, was a cautionary tale of what not to do.
Yeah.
And that ultimately led to the creation of Hugh Kitchen with my wife and her brother. Hugh Kitchen started as a restaurant. Our slogan is "Get Back to Human," which is why it's called Hugh, as in human.
Yeah.
Because all of my research and all of my learnings and how I cured myself was based on the fact that we don't live the way humans have evolved. We don't live in a way that's consistent with thriving. And so we wanted to create a mecca as a restaurant of everything in the restaurant. And we opened that restaurant in New York City in 2012. It was extremely strict, way stricter than I eat, and just for your audience, I don't think you need to be this strict, but the whole restaurant was...
You wouldn't know it because the food tastes amazing.
Yeah, the whole restaurant was gluten-free, dairy-free, refined sugar-free. We were seed oil-free in 2012. Yeah. And people thought I was insane.
I mean, literally, no one knows about it now, but let alone that long ago.
Right. And it was like an oasis. Like people would go, people like you and me would go in.
I went there every time in New York. I was a frequent customer.
Yeah. And you would just look around. You'd be like, I can eat everything.
Yeah. I packed my carry-on. I'd fill my carry-on to the brim to go back home because it was just, you couldn't find anything like it.
Yeah. And it was an experiment and people thought I was nuts.
Yeah.
And we had no outside investors because no one in their right mind would have given us money to do it. So it was just me and my family.
Yeah.
In the beginning, we eventually took outside investors, but the first 5 years was just us. And we had no idea what we were doing.
How long did it take for it to catch on, or did it catch on right away? The cult following that was Hugh Kitchen.
It took, so the first 5 months were an unmitigated disaster. Like there were many days, and for the entrepreneurs who are listening, there were many days that literally I was preparing the night before to close it down. It was losing a staggering amount of money. We had all sorts of like challenges and issues, including family dynamic issues. And I just had this kind of like thought, like, I have to do this. I have to do this. Yeah. And then one day, I had to keep dumping money into the business for the first 5 months, and it was giving me anxiety attacks because it was just like, it was hemorrhaging money. And one day I remember, because I was also running my own hedge fund at the time.
Okay, so you're doing both.
I was doing both. It was insane. Okay. It was a very bad timing. And my wife and her brother, my brother-in-law, were running it. And my wife was literally asking me for money like every week, like, and it was so awful. Yeah. And I remember like a few weeks went by where she didn't ask me for money. And I said, hey, I just noticed that you didn't ask me for money. Yeah. And she goes, we actually went cash flow positive. We don't need money right now. And I was like, yes.
That's amazing.
And then the word of mouth kind of happened. And we had a bunch of like high profile celebrities. And this is before like the influencer time. We had a bunch of high profile celebrities come in. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of people like talked about who was there. And it just kind of got this like cult. Mm-hmm. And the chocolate was an accident. Okay.
I saw it all of a sudden, right? It was like it was in the restaurant.
Yeah. So the chocolate. So we had, if you remember,
Hugh chocolate for people.
Hugh chocolate. Yeah. So if you remember, we had so the restaurant, for those who never went, the restaurant was kind of like an ancestral food court. Yeah, it was. And it wasn't like a sit down kind of restaurant. It was more like a fast casual. And we had a bakery in the front on the left. Yeah. Where we had gluten-free, grain-free cookies, muffins, scones, banana bread, that kind of stuff. And before we opened, we wanted to have chocolate chips in some of these things. And when we went and looked for chocolate chips to put in them, we couldn't find any chocolate chips that met our guardrails, right? All the chocolate that we found that for chocolate chips for like restaurants had soy lecithin in it. Mm-hmm. It had genetically modified cane sugar in it. And we're like, wow, we can't find chocolate chips. We got to make our own chocolate chips. Mm-hmm. And we didn't know anything about making chocolate. And long story short, we hired a consultant who helped us like develop our recipe, which was only organic cacao and organic unrefined coconut sugar. Just 2 ingredients. Yeah. That's it. And we eventually came up with a chocolate chip that we loved. And my brother-in-law had this great idea of like, we should turn these into chocolate bars and sell them in the restaurant. Mm-hmm. And they were like basically handmade at the time. And and he started selling them in the restaurant. We started selling them in the restaurant, and they were flying at $10 a piece. And by the way, we had to sell them for $10 because it was so expensive to make them by hand. And people were coming in from like out of the state and buying 10 at a time. Yeah. And at that moment, I kind of realized, as a businessman, I'm like, there's something here. Yeah. And then we decided strategically as a family to kind of separate the two businesses in terms of Hugh Restaurant and Hugh Chocolate. And that we were going to lean into the chocolate because that was something we felt could scale and reach a lot more people quickly than just the restaurant.
Got it. So then 2020 happened, and that was kind of accelerated that shift. How did that work?
So the restaurant opened in 2012.
Yeah.
We started selling the chocolate externally. So Whole Foods was our first external customer, and that was in 2013. Okay. And that was kind of a fluke how that happened. And
I didn't realize you were in Whole Foods that early.
Yeah.
Wow.
It only started in one store.
Okay.
So this was pre-Amazon.
Got it.
Before Amazon bought Whole Foods. And it was during the time, many of your listeners may remember that Whole Foods used to have this concept called local foragers. And they were people that could actually source food that was local, that wasn't ready for national, like from a regulatory standpoint. Like a lot of the local food that they sourced didn't even have nutrition facts panels on them.
Wow.
And one of our chefs at the time, his girlfriend was a local forager at the Columbus Circle location.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And she used to eat our chocolate, and she's like, this is the best healthy chocolate I've ever had.
That's a great Whole Foods, by the way.
She's like, can we sell this at Columbus Circle?
Yeah.
And we were like, sure. And that was how that started. And we had both going at the same time for 8 years. Okay. And 2020 was kind of a unique time because it was COVID and our lease was up. And we saw the chocolate business had become quite big at that point, and we saw what was happening to the traffic because no one was coming during COVID. And so we basically just said, we're going to close down the restaurant. I had moved to Austin already. Okay. And we're just going to focus on the chocolate company.
Yeah, amazing. So do you think you'd ever bring back a restaurant? Do you think you'd ever?
Well, I'm doing it with True Food Kitchen.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
Yeah.
So you literally are a part of two of my favorite restaurants. So tell me about the transition to True Food Kitchen.
Yeah. So HumanCo, my second business.
Yeah.
So just as a little bit of background, I had my hedge fund until the beginning of 2019. And and that means I was in the hedge fund business for basically almost 21 years straight.
Yeah.
And I had a remarkable run. I was very blessed with the financial success of what I was doing as an investor. But starting around 2015, 2015 was one of those years where I had achieved everything I ever had dreamed of in the financial business. We won Best New Hedge Fund of the Year, Best New Manager. I was in the Wall Street Journal. We had the biggest and best year I'd ever had. And I remember we were at like this award ceremony, which was like the Oscars equivalent of hedge fund world, where I won like 3 different things that year. And I was walking off the stage with these like glass trophies. And I said to my wife, I had this like pit in my stomach. And I said to my wife, I said, I don't think I can do better than this. And she's like, what do you mean? And I said, this is literally like everything I ever worked for and hoped for. And I feel hollow. And I feel like I got to the top of my mountain and there's nothing to see. And I spent 18 years doing it at the time. And Hugh was starting to really take off at that point, and I got so much personal fulfillment from Hugh. And the thing that was remarkable about Hugh, and it was sort of a surprise, was we used to get letters from people, and the letters would be like from families, from moms, from people who had autoimmune diseases or any kind of disease. And some of these letters were so touching. They were like, "You literally saved my life." Like, I didn't think I could ever have sweets again. I didn't think I could ever have chocolate. I didn't think I could ever do this. And these letters like would make me tear up. And I never got letters like that from my investors at a hedge fund.
Yeah.
You know?
That would be a thing.
Yeah, never.
If that ever happened.
And I had this kind of the same voice in my head that would told me how I could cure my eye disease. That voice got really loud in 2015.
Okay.
And it basically said, like, you did that chapter, you realize that's probably not your life's calling. You should focus on healing people, and you should focus on health and wellness.
Wow.
And it was a very difficult time for me because I had a big firm. I had 40 people working for me. It was incredibly lucrative. And I started having like the first, what it's spiritually, sometimes they call dark night of the soul, where I started going through some deep, deep depression. And on the surface, everything looked great. You know, my family was fine. My health was fine. You know, my financial situation was great. But I felt like my soul was rotting. And my wife wanted me to quit. And she's like, you got to stop. You got to stop. And it was my identity. And it's what I'd done for 18 years.
Yeah.
And I let it go too long. And I ended up finally returning all the money and retiring and closing down the hedge fund at the end of 2018. But before that happened, I kind of had this idea of what do I want the rest of my life to look like, where I could combine how I want to help humanity and I could combine that with business because I didn't want to like retire, you know, and I came up with this idea of HumanCo.
Yeah. And
HumanCo was modeled after, because a lot of the work that I had done as a public market investor, I studied all these public companies, and many of the big food conglomerates are over 100 years old. General Mills is over 100 years old. And there's a benefit to why they are a conglomerate. There's a real benefit to the structure and how they have lots of brands, except that all these food conglomerates, as you know, which now we call big food, they make the super majority of their profits off of ultra processed junk food. And I thought, what if there was like a new model? What if we could create a new kind of conglomerate that bought and built mission-driven brands that help people live healthier lives? And it was something that you could eventually take public. And it was something that people could trust, that everything underneath the umbrella had the same values. And that you as a consumer could say, oh, I know Jason, I know HumanCo, I know if it's in the HumanCo portfolio, I can trust it.
Yeah.
Which was kind of what people felt about Hugh Kitchen, the restaurant.
Yes.
Was that as soon as you walked into the restaurant, you're like, oh, I can eat anything in here. And that was where the idea of HumanCo came from.
Yeah.
And then I finally retired. It was very difficult. It was really heart-wrenching to do it. And
how old were you at that time when you?
So I was 42.
Okay.
I was 42.
Like stepping away.
Yeah.
It was tough.
It was really hard. And I walked away from a huge financial annuity. Every year, like my business was very lucrative.
And was it that nudging, that dark night of the soul that did it? Because that's a huge leap of faith to like be given all. It was
a combination of, I had some very, very unfortunate things happen that kind of catalyzed it. So after that big pivotal year, my best friend and business partner of 16 years killed himself. And it was someone that I had known and worked with since college. And the hedge fund business can be pretty dark. It's all about money. It's all about workaholism and hustle. And you're ultimately not, despite what you might want to rationalize to yourself, you're not really creating anything. And you're not really doing anything. You're just arbitraging pieces of paper for money. And when he died, I fell into the darkest depression. And it was bad. And I had a close friend who had severe PTSD. He was a survivor in a terrorist attack. And he introduced me to psychedelics. As therapy. And I had never really done anything like that. I was kind of a Boy Scout in college because I was an athlete. I was very much against psychedelics, but I also knew that I didn't want to take pharmaceuticals. I refused. I was doing a lot of traditional talk therapy that wasn't really helping me. And I knew I didn't want to take pharma. And my close friend, who I really trusted, he was a very empirical, scientific kind of guy. He said, Jason, you got to try this. I think it'll help you with your depression. I think it'll help you get over the guilt and the mourning that I was going through for my best friend. And when I did that, which was in 17, it was the beginning of like the rest of my life, and it changed my perspective, and it gave me clarity on what I think I meant to do in this world. And that, was a combination of a bunch of factors that ultimately, I feel like for many people, you have to go into the belly of the beast to be able to transform.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like the classic
Alchemy.
hero's journey.
Yeah.
That you have to go into despair to sort of confront
Transmute.
your demons
Yeah.
and confront what it is that you know about yourself. And it gives you the crystal clarity of what I think for each person, whatever their soul's calling is.
That's
and that was
beautiful.
when my soul kind of really came out
Rebirth.
and said, you need to do this, and you need to stop all of this investing, because you've done it. Like, you made a bunch of money, but like, this isn't why you're here on earth.
So you had some massive epiphanies through that process.
Massive.
What was it? Psilocybin, ayahuasca?
It was a combination of psilocybin and MDMA.
Okay.
In a very guided therapeutic setting, with this brilliant individual in New York, who at the time in 2017, psychedelic therapy was extremely underground, and it felt really shady. I had to communicate with him over, Signal, and it felt like I was doing like something very nefarious.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. It was a beautiful thing, and this individual has helped thousands of people.
Yeah.
And it really opened my eyes to how healing, again, in a guided therapeutic setting, not recreationally, about how healing this can be for all sorts of issues, from PTSD to addiction to depression to anxiety. And it was so incredible for me that I became a philanthropist around psychedelic healing modalities for other people.
It's amazing. Are you involved with MAPS?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm a member of a group called the PSFC, which is the Psychedelic Science Funding Collaborative, which is a group of the largest philanthropists in the United States, all focused on using psychedelic healing modalities, primarily for veterans and primarily for severe trauma, like capital T trauma. And then I started doing it about twice a year after that as a maintenance thing with this same individual. And every time it was incredibly valuable and therapeutic for me. And every time, and everyone's experience is different, but for me, every time I would do the therapy, I would see something about myself that I hadn't healed in vivid, lucid detail, and I would heal it in the journey.
In the session.
And it was like kind of peeling an onion. And every time I would get kind of more clarity about who I am, what I'm here to do, why I'm so passionate about helping people, and why I think it's so important that we awaken everybody as to how enslaved we've become. And how much bullshit we've been fed around everything in modern society. And how to get back, to being more human, and how to really reestablish our connection with each other, how to establish our connection to Mother Earth, how to establish our connection to our food sources. And it actually gave me a tremendous amount of insight into why we're so sick. And
so I want to get into that spiritual undercurrent, but before I do that, I just want to, you mentioned the HumanCo brands, like before we move on to the spiritual stuff that I want to talk to you about, what are the brands under the HumanCo?
Sure.
True Food you mentioned.
Yeah. So True Food, and you had asked about this. So when we moved to Austin, and part of my kind of metamorphosis was retiring from the hedge fund business and then moving to Austin with my family. And then we relocated Hugh here, and we relocated HumanCo here. My family and I would eat at True Food Kitchen, and I hadn't heard of True Food before we moved to Austin.
Really?
And when we would eat there, I was like, wow, this is like the closest thing to Hugh Kitchen that I have found. And it's a different format. It's sit down. It was started by Dr. Andrew Weil, who ironically was one of my inspirations.
Yeah, I love him.
When I was curing my eye disease. He was one of the few people that I read.
Right.
Mark Hyman was just getting started. Andy Weil had books from like the 80s.
Yes.
And
who was also part of the psychedelic.
He was also part of the psychedelic movement. I'm getting the chills because there's so much full circle here. And I had an investment vehicle at the time where we were looking to make a significant investment in something very big. And it was my wife who one day said, why don't you do it with True Food Kitchen? And I said, like, I don't know anything about True Food. It was a private company. There was not much information on it. And long story short, we ended up courting them to take HumanCo as a very significant investor.
Got it. Okay.
And we wanted to help them transform from what was a brand that was started 15 years ago and in my opinion became a little like not cool. It was a little stale in terms of its like style. And I wanted to make it more approachable for everybody. And I believed also that having studied a lot of the big public restaurant companies, that most of the big, large restaurant companies sell garbage. And I thought, you know, there needs to be a sit-down experience because many of the newer, healthier concepts, like Sweetgreen, were fast casual. And part of my belief is that we need to spend more time with each other and we need to spend more time like disconnecting. And what I loved about True Food is that you could actually sit down for an hour and have a nice conversation, bring your family. You're not eating at your desk.
Yeah.
And there was nothing like True Food. And so that was why we got involved with it. And only a couple months ago, so we ended up investing in buying about a third of the company. There were a few other big investors. Oprah Winfrey is actually one of the largest investors. And a few months ago, we actually bought control of
Amazing.
True Food.
See, I didn't know your full involvement with it. This is fascinating.
And it's very recent. And so now we're in a position where we can really turn it into what we want.
Amazing. And I see you in True Food now. Like I see your artistic touch from the food standpoint.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming.
Yeah. I'm sure it's just the beginning.
It's just the beginning. And
because I've been a long time, patron of True Food Kitchen too. Yeah,
and we're the only restaurant. We're the only full service restaurant in the United States that is seed oil that doesn't cook with seed oils.
Yeah. And that was the problem in the wellness community. It was like, it's like the next best thing to Hugh Kitchen, but the oils weren't where Hugh Kitchen was.
And so, that just changed a year ago.
It just changed.
And we're constantly upgrading our ingredients and trying to change some of the stuff. We also have Cosmic Bliss, which used to be called Coconut Bliss. We bought that company because it was my favorite ice cream. It's organic. There's no refined sugar. It's fair trade ingredients. The packaging is sustainable. It's the cleanest nationally available ice cream in the country. And it started off as purely plant-based, and we created the first 100% grass-fed, grass-finished dairy ice cream. Amazing. That's nationally available.
I haven't had it. I need to try that.
It's amazing. Yeah, if you eat dairy, it's the best. So we bought Cosmic Bliss. We created an organic pizza bite that was supposed to go after Totino's. Snow Days. Big fan. And grain-free, gluten-free, seed oil-free. And then we also bought I have a gluten-free house. And we bought our favorite pizza company.
Yes,
Against the Grain.
Yeah.
Which is also grain-free, gluten-free, seed oil-free.
And you shifted that oil too, right? Because it used to have seed oil.
It was canola oil.
Yeah.
So we bought it. And within the first year, we had to transition away from the canola oil, and we moved it to 100% olive oil. And that obviously was not good for our margins. That cost us money. It made our margins worse. But I believe that part of the responsibility of business people is to upgrade ingredients.
Yeah.
And whereas every company that I know of, when they buy a company, they downgrade the ingredients.
Yes.
They try to make it cheaper, more shelf stable, increase the margins.
Yeah.
And then so those are the three primary brands. True Food Kitchen we mentioned. We recently made a strategic investment into an organic baby food company called Amara.
Okay.
no sugar added, whole food for babies and toddlers. They're best known for, they make these, if anyone has toddlers, they'll know this because my kids love these. They're called like smoothie melts. Yogi is like one of the brands, but their main ingredient is sugar.
Yeah.
This is whole fruit. And there's a dehydration method that we use where we don't have to actually add anything to it.
Yeah.
It's just a great snack for kids.
Okay.
And then we also made a strategic investment into the kind of only anti-plastic, non-toxic marketplace called Grove Collaborative.
Amazing.
And Grove Collaborative is like, if you know Thrive Market,
Yeah.
it's basically like Thrive Market, but for home and personal care. So all personal care, things like compostable garbage bags, soap that doesn't come in plastic, everything's focused on reusability and sustainability and non-toxic ingredients. Yeah. So it's like a whole, like if you want to take your home, your kitchen, your bathroom, and you want to make it less toxic and less plastic, Grove Collaborative is where you should shop.
It's beautiful to see how God has used you.
Yes.
I mean, you're in it. I don't know how much you see, but from the outside, just seeing this thread, that's so awesome to see.
Yeah, no, it's been quite a journey. And I can tell you that it's a hard one because having been both an investor and then being an entrepreneur, what you realize is that making stuff the right way is always harder. Yeah. Because you can't take shortcuts. You can't use all the synthetic garbage that's cheaper, that's more widely available. That's why they do it. You're always competing on price because Americans have been taught wrongfully that they should seek out the cheapest possible version of things. And it's been hard, and it's been a lot of this for me has been a lot of philanthropy because, these businesses, I haven't like made $1 or collected $1 of salary in almost 6 years since I've been doing this.
Wow. That's a testament though too.
Yeah.
It's like that's what it takes, I guess, to build these brands.
Yeah. And I've invested a massive amount of my own money into all these businesses because I think the world needs them. And I'm also trying to set an example for other entrepreneurs that I believe there is a way where you can help people and have a good business at the same time. Yeah. And I think the paradigm is shifting. And since our Senate panel, where we talked about all the things that we'll get into, and really, the rise of Bobby Kennedy and RFK Jr., and what's happened in the last 6 months has been the most encouraging period for all of this awakening that I have seen since I've been starting doing this 20 years ago.
100%. 100%. So that's a good transition. I think it was the spring of 2024. You wrote an activist letter to Kellogg's.
March, yep.
March. So what precipitated that?
Okay.
Yeah.
So
this is what got it all started.
Yeah, this is what really accelerated it. Yeah. So Vani Hari, known as the Food Babe, she and I have known each other probably 10 years.
Okay.
And I first got in touch with her early days of Hugh, because I was starting to notice that these big public food companies were like corrupt and a disaster. And she was the one who first started highlighting the difference in ingredients in other countries. And I kind of knew about it, but I didn't know about it the way that she was sort of educating people on in her very early activism days. And I became friendly with Callie Means probably a year ago. We just met through friends of friends because we have all the same interests. And I was, I don't remember how it happened, but somebody had shown me the advertisement that Kellogg's had made where they were trying to get American families to eat cereal for dinner. And there was this it looks like a Saturday Night Live commercial, the one with Tony the Tiger when he comes into the people's, and I would encourage all of you guys to Google this ad, the Tony the Tiger cereal for dinner ad, because it's insane.
And Gary Pilnick talked about it also in interviews.
Yes, and he was talking about it, and he was basically trying to say food's become expensive, there's been too much inflation, so as a way to combat the inflation, we are encouraging American families to eat a bowl of Frosted Flakes for dinner and to stop eating chicken. And when that happened, I lost my mind.
Got it.
And I'm just like, enough. I can't take this anymore. And a friend of mine is a very prominent lawyer named Alex Spiro, who's actually Elon's lawyer. He's sort of known as a bulldog and as a brilliant kind of trial lawyer. And I was talking to him about it one day. He was here in Austin, and he's just like, why don't we write an activist letter? And I was just like, yes, let's do that. And so Avani and Callie helped me write that letter. And we published it and sent it to the board of directors. We sent it to Gary. We sent it on all the different social media channels. And I knew that with activism, which is different than a technical lawsuit. So shareholder activism, you're not technically suing the company, but you're using kind of shareholder influence to try to get them to change. I knew that there was a chance that they would basically say like, thanks, but we don't care. But I wanted to make it public conversation. And it was meant to be sort of a publicity thing to make everyone aware that this was happening. Because most people don't know this.
Yeah. And the media really picked it up.
Yeah, the media picked it up. Yeah. And basically Kellogg's wrote me back. We demanded a meeting and said, look, we'd like to meet with your executives. We'd like to tell you, and just for a little more background, in 2015, Kellogg's had made a public pledge to remove artificial food dyes from their cereals.
Yeah. And was it true that it was Michelle Obama and somehow her influence that pushed that?
I don't know.
Someone told me that. I don't know if it's true.
I don't know. I mean, there was some focus on it back then, but what happened was Trix cereal, which is owned by General Mills, decided to take out food dyes, and their sales plummeted.
Okay.
And they brought it back because their sales dropped so much when their cereal went from neon bright to not bright. And I think that probably influenced Kellogg's to quietly abandon their pledge. They had their pledge on their website. They had media acclaim. Everyone was like, yay, you're doing it. And then they just quietly like ignored it. And they started making more cereals for toddlers that had this garbage in it. And so part of the letter talked about that. And it talked about the fact that it is anti-American that we are served a more toxic, inferior version of something that you already make in other countries. They already have the formulation. They already sell it in Canada and Australia and the UK with colorants that come from fruit. And there's over 80 peer-reviewed scientific papers on how these food dyes are neurotoxic, how they influence children's behavior, children's learning abilities. But the skeptics, which you've heard now from our collective mission, try to say that it is not overwhelmingly conclusive. So they call us pseudoscientists, and they claim that the evidence is not overwhelmingly conclusive.
The woo-woo caucus.
Yeah, we were called the woo-woo caucus. And I pointed out that I basically said, like if American moms or families or anyone consuming this stuff, if they actually saw that there were these two choices and you made them the same price, no one with education would choose the toxic version over the one that they sell in Canada.
Yeah.
So they wrote me a letter back, basically saying, thanks for your letter. We're willing to meet with you under these conditions. First, we're not going to talk about Kellogg's. We're only going to talk about the industry. Second, we're going to bring the head of the lobbyist association. So, and we may not bring Gary, so they hedged that. And we're only willing to debate and discuss the science of food dyes. And I'm just like, come on. So I wrote back, no thanks. We want to talk about Kellogg's. We're not your enemy. I'm willing to help you. I said, I'm willing to consult to help you make the transition. You could look like a hero for doing this. But I obviously knew as a businessman and as an investor that it would cost them some money and it would lower their margins if they switched. And it would make it less bright and less appealing to little children. And they basically wrote back, if you're not willing to meet under these conditions, we're not going to meet with you. And until this is made illegal, we're going to keep doing it and go pound sand.
Yeah.
And
because these ingredients require warning labels if they were used in other countries,
correct,
which are not
correct.
even used
So
because of that.
in these other countries, so some of these ingredients are banned in certain countries. Some of these ingredients are heavily regulated, and they require a cigarette-like warning label. And you could Google this. They require a cigarette-like warning label that literally says, like, this contains ingredients known to cause behavioral and learning disorders in children. And no food company wants to have that warning label on the front of their package.
Yeah.
So these food companies are complicit. They know that these things are harmful, and that's why they switch their ingredients in these other countries. Yeah. They know this. Yeah. And yet they're still selling it here because they're allowed to.
Yeah. So what do you say? I mean, I want to go to, because most of our listeners know, okay, these things are toxic. And some of the pushback that we get within the wellness community is like, none of you guys even eat Kellogg's. Why are you doing that?
Yes.
Just don't eat cereal.
Right.
Yeah. I talked to another functional medicine doctor the other day. She kind of had that opinion. So I know my take on it, but like, how would you answer that to all the wellness world out there?
Yeah. So what most people don't realize is that a lot of public schools, and the SNAP program, which used to be called food stamps. So for people who can't afford food, and a lot of lower income communities literally get all of their daily calories in school for the children. That's where they eat. Mm-hmm. And they don't have a choice.
Yes.
And this is Kellogg's won't disclose this, but it is a double-digit, very significant percentage of their sales come from public schools and come from the SNAP program. And so all of these people don't have a choice. And so while people like us have a choice to say we're not going to eat cereal, these communities do not have a choice.
Right.
So this is terrible. Right. And that's my pushback, is that I don't think you should eat sugar cereals, period. That's the other thing, is people are like, the Canadian version is still also not healthy. Mm-hmm. Of course, but that's missing the point.
Yeah, we're talking about
it's missing the point. If you can make something a little bit better, that people are still going to eat, you have to meet people where they are. Mm-hmm. You have to acknowledge that Kellogg's US does $2.5 billion of sales a year, right? You have 100 million boxes of Fruit Loops sold a year. Mm-hmm. So you have to acknowledge that that's not changing overnight. Mm-hmm. And if we have a way to clean up what people are already eating, we should do that. And that's the first of many steps. Yeah. Where we'll then go after more companies. And we'll then start to educate people about why you shouldn't eat ultra-processed sugar cereal, even if it is only with the fruit colorants. Right.
So I've heard you talk a little bit about, and I don't want to get into it even more, this spiritual connection, I think, to the state of affairs right now with our food, and specifically what's happening with big food and cereal.
Yes. So part of what's happened to me in my own journey and awakening was I used to be an atheist. I was an atheist for 22 years.
Wow.
I was raised Jewish.
Yeah.
And when I studied the Holocaust, it actually made me an atheist, because I sort of thought that if there was like this all-knowing, benevolent God, he wouldn't have allowed the Holocaust to happen. Yeah. Which there's actually plenty of Jews that have that belief. Mm-hmm. And through both the miracles that I've experienced directly, like healing my eye disease when everyone told me it couldn't happen, through meeting hundreds of people over the last decade who have cured incurable diseases, and then reading stories of thousands and thousands of people who have cured diseases without modern medicine, it started to make me question that maybe my empirical, pure scientific approach was flawed. And I started getting really curious about all of the things that arrogant, hubristic scientists don't know the answer to. So, for example, the placebo effect, which is in every single scientific controlled human trial. Every scientist knows that if you're going to do a drug trial on humans, you have to incorporate the placebo effect, right? Which is that we have a way of influencing the outcome by how we think. We have no idea how that works. We still don't know. Yeah. And we have no idea of the origin of life. We have no idea of how Earth came to be. And I used to be literally trained as a scientist. And when you start spending time with brilliant scientists, there's this pattern that's happened with brilliant scientists over hundreds of years. This happened with Nikola Tesla. This happened with Edison. This happened with Einstein, where the smartest scientists actually become spiritual because they realize there's tons of questions they can't answer.
Yeah.
And it's so insane how complex the human organism is that it cannot be possible that it came from randomness.
Yes.
And, I used to be obsessed with astronomy. And when I was growing up, the Big Bang Theory of how the universe came to be, they said that was 5 billion years old. And now they're saying it's 14 billion years old. That's a huge difference. We have no idea what the fuck we're talking about. Like, we really don't. Like, they've changed it 3 times since I was a kid, this Big Bang Theory.
Yeah.
And then the advent of quantum physics, where everything that's subatomic doesn't adhere to what we think of as what are called Newtonian physics. And the more you start digging into these things and the more you start studying like Nikola Tesla, who was deeply spiritual, deeply.
Carl Jung as well.
Carl Jung was deeply spiritual. Einstein was very spiritual. You start realizing that there's like a lot we can't explain. And when we have tried as humans to play God and we have pretended that we know everything, it has always ended in disaster. And the example that I love to talk about was in 1958, Mao Zedong, who was overseeing China at the time. China was an agrarian culture, and they were trying to make the farming system to be more industrialized. And he was trying to sort of lift up China as a powerhouse, and that was kind of the beginning. And what they noticed with the farming community was that a lot of their grains were being eaten by birds. And so Mao Zedong came up with a campaign, and this has been very heavily suppressed, called the Smash Sparrows campaign. And this was a campaign where he told every citizen to kill as many sparrows as you could, so that people could have more grain, right? It sounds like a logical thing to want to do. But of course, when you try to mess with nature and you try to mess with what are called complex adaptive systems, you can never fully anticipate what all the side effects are. And what they didn't realize was that the sparrows ate locusts. And they ended up killing several hundred sparrows. And it created the greatest mass starvation event in human history because the locusts went crazy because there were no sparrows to eat the locusts.
Yeah.
45 million Chinese people died. And it got so bad that some of the people turned cannibal and they suppressed all this information because it was the greatest man-made disaster basically in human history.
Yeah.
And it was just a highlight that when you try to play God and mess with nature, like nature's always smarter than us.
Yeah.
And when you study these kinds of things, and I started getting really deeply immersed in what I call the meta crisis. And the meta crisis is the simultaneous crisis that's happening right now of human health, mental health, and planetary health. And when you look at all 3 of those things, and Callie and Casey talk about the human health part, but the mental health part and the planetary health part are just as bad. 69 vertebrate populations across the world in the last 50 years is down 69%. In terms of like weather disasters, they have a way of tracking how much damage weather events are doing and how statistically significant these weather events are, from floods, earthquakes, cyclone bombs, all these tornadoes, all these weird things, earthquake in New York. We are now getting many 1 in 100 year, 1 in 1,000 year type of events every year. And people aren't paying attention.
Yeah.
And then on the mental health, suicide rates, 2023, all-time highs. Loneliness is now the greatest predictor of early death, greater than cigarettes. Science can't really explain loneliness, and we can't quantify it, but we know it's actually killing people.
Yeah.
And so I started to become really spiritual around the fact that there's all this stuff we can't explain. And if you look at the data, we are the sickest we have ever been on all these metrics at a time when we spend more than we've ever had. We are more technologically advanced than we've ever been. We have more pharmaceuticals than we've ever had. We have more pharmaceutical interventions and medical devices than we've ever had. We exercise more than we ever have. And we have more knowledge than we've ever had.
Mm-hmm.
And our health attributes on mental health, physical health, and planetary health are at all-time worsts.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it more like spiritually, what sometimes people who study like epistemology, they talk about are maps of reality in terms of like, how do we think the world works? How do we think humans work? How do we think nature works? Our maps of reality are completely broken.
Yeah.
Because obviously, the more we've spent, the more we know, the worse we've gotten. We have to look in the mirror and say, this isn't working.
Yeah.
And then when you study those indigenous peoples that I talk about, and you look at how healthy they are, and yes, they still have acute health issues, right? And science has been great at addressing acute health problems like infections.
Cleanliness.
Yeah, and cleanliness,
hygiene.
that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like our disconnection and chronic diseases, it's never been worse.
Yeah.
And so what I have found when I've studied the peoples that are the healthiest, they have direct connection with nature. They have direct connection with each other. They have direct connection with God and faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we as a species, we have to be humble enough to recognize that there is a lot we can't explain. There's a lot we don't know. And that the closer we go back to nature and the closer we get to God's untainted bounty of creation,
yes,
the healthier we become.
Yep.
And it's very clear, but it's not something that's easily done in scientific controlled studies.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of what I have been pushing, it's why my company is called HumanCo, is because we know what it takes to heal each other.
Yeah.
But we're not doing it because we have become obsessed with technology. We've become obsessed with all of these things that have actually sedated us. They've enslaved us.
Right.
And it's almost like a dark force that is making us feel like we're making progress, but when in fact we're actually going backwards.
Yeah.
And we might be making financial progress and we're making technological progress, but when you actually look at the state of the meta crisis, it's not working.
Yeah. It's distracting, it's numbing us, it's enslaving us in that dopamine hit, that cheap dopamine hit.
It's everything. It's a soup. And I actually believe that we're living in a slow motion apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like a quick Noah's Ark kind of apocalypse. Yeah. But we are quite literally extincting ourselves. I mean, fertility rates are down 50%. Men's sperm count's down 50% in 40 years. Yeah. Like if you were a non-human race that was trying to subtly and quietly and insidiously extinct us without us knowing it, like a frog in a boiling pot, this is what you would be doing. Yes. And we're not paying attention to the fact that we're slowly extincting ourselves.
Yeah. And like you said, the last year or so during this election, I think there's been an acceleration of more and more people waking up. I think the pandemic woke a lot of people up.
Yes, it did.
I was at a lunch with Bobby Kennedy about a year and a half ago, and I said that to him, that I feel like there's this palpable spiritual undercurrent and the things that you're saying. And he said everywhere he goes, he's seeing the same thing you just said.
Yeah.
Like there is a growing informed populace that are demanding more.
Yes.
What do you say to people like with the election, the whole, you mentioned Bobby Kennedy, the Make America Great, the Maha movement, they're skeptical of it because they see Trump, he's not necessarily a beacon of health. They think we're being duped in the wellness world to trust him. Obviously time will tell, but what's your take on that?
Well, look, I think, and you and I have both posted about this. Yeah. Health and what I'll call broadly the meta crisis should not be a partisan issue. It just so happens it became partisan when Bobby Kennedy, who was running as an independent, decided to join forces with Trump. And then, unfortunately, a lot of people who were very anti-Trump sort of viewed anything that was coming out of Bobby now to be a implicit endorsement of Trump. I've tried to be, historically, I've been a Democrat. Trump obviously says a lot of stupid shit. He's obviously not a man historically who's been of high integrity. And he's obviously a man that is very difficult to explain to your children that this is the president of our United States. So I don't want to make this political at all. But the reason why, and I thought Max Lugavere's post on Twitter was so well written when he said, I'm not voting for Trump. I'm voting for change of, and then he listed like 20 things.
Yeah.
And so he was voting for the regime change, not Trump as an individual. And I think what Trump has represented, and why he won in a landslide, was because people realize now, and people are waking up, that what has been happening isn't working. And what he wants to do and what Bobby wants to do, particularly Bobby, I can speak to Bobby because I know Bobby and I know what he wants to do. And I think it'll have profound changes on our human health, planetary health, and mental health. I hope he is allowed to have a sledgehammer.
Yeah.
I have seen firsthand the corruption in big business, big food, big chem, big ag. It's real. And it's dark, dude. It is dark. Like I've seen it firsthand. You've seen now a bunch of it, how people are secretly funded to write research that goes against what we're saying. I also know that, and again, I'm saying this from a science background. I also know that with human nutritional studies, you can basically make it show whatever you want.
Yeah. Cherry pick data.
You can cherry pick data, and I've just seen hundreds and hundreds of studies that are conflicting. It's very hard to run them properly because you can't do a control with humans. And I think we have to get back to a place where our intuition matters and common sense matters.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these things are common sense. Like I don't need 10 years of conclusive studies to know that ingesting synthetic chemicals derived from petroleum, I don't need studies to show that we shouldn't be eating that. And that's the approach that Europe takes. And there's so many things like that where, and there's a lot of stuff that's more nuanced and there's a lot of stuff that I think should deserve more debate, but there's certain things that are ridiculously.
And that was the point you made when you testified before Congress. You said like, that's why you mentioned the artificial dyes.
Yes.
There's a lot of, healthy debate that you can have on certain nutritional topics, but artificial dyes should be black and white.
Yes.
And I'm surprised that since then, there are people that really want to defend artificial dyes.
Yeah.
They're going to still die on that dye hill.
And they try to gaslight you on a few things. They say that if you get rid of dyes, it's going to inhibit innovation. They say that it's actually going to make food prices go up. And it might make food prices go up a little bit, but people shouldn't be poisoned, period, no matter how cheap it is.
Yeah. Right. No matter how cheap the poison is.
It's a ridiculous argument.
Yeah.
And I think what I would encourage everybody to do is to just be more open-minded and skeptical and to just look around and realize, Einstein has like the greatest quote, which is the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We know we're at the worst right now. So we must drastically change what we're doing. And I don't think it's one variable. I think it's a lot of variables. I think it's obviously I'm tackling more of the food part of it and getting rid of the toxins out of our food system. But I think the mental health crisis is just as severe and just as bad. And we are in an epidemic of isolation. We are in an epidemic of loneliness. We are in an epidemic of being addicted to dopamine through things like social media, Netflix, all the streaming apps. And again, I love all these things. I use these things. But these are all distractions to pull us away from our connection to each other, to pull us away from our connection to our families.
Yeah.
These are all things that are breaking up the American family. They're breaking up our respect for Earth. And we have gotten to the point, and I actually believe that we are getting messages and signals every day from above that we need to change. And if this were 2,000 years ago when people respected that there was something bigger than us, they listened to those warnings. They were like, oh, wow, like this is probably a warning sign. I should listen to this and change. And we have become so hubristic and arrogant in our own scientific method, which is fine. And I love science, but we've become so arrogant that we have ignored the possibility that these signs are real. And we need to drastically change. And so what I am encouraged by with Trump winning and Bobby getting in there is they're going to do some drastic things. Yeah. I don't know if it's all going to work. It might make some hot messes, but we need to really change things.
Yeah. I mean, it's unsustainable the way that it is.
It's unsustainable.
Right. We have to do something different to see something different. I have loved this conversation. Before we go, the podcast is called The Art of Being Well. At the end of every episode, we have your art of being well. First question is, this is going to be good. What's the worst tasting healthy food that you eat? It tastes freaking disgusting, but you eat it because of you're not doing it for the taste.
Glutathione.
Yeah.
Oral glutathione
sulfury.
Is absolutely disgusting. Yes. So like that's not a food, but I have to take oral glutathione to help me detox.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's wretched. I would say I don't eat a lot of foods that I think are objectively gross. I definitely take some supplements that are objectively gross.
Any other gross supplements?
Phosphatidylcholine is disgusting.
Oh yeah, it's another one.
Yeah, that tastes like engine oil. That is wretched.
Yeah, I know it, but those are the top two things that patients complain about.
Yes, those would be the two. The other thing I would say, which is I think helpful for your listeners, the reason that I have chosen all of these categories: chocolate, pizza, ice cream, everything we serve at True Food, as opposed to like protein bars made out of salad, is because food is an intrinsic part of human culture, and we are supposed to enjoy the deliciousness of food. Yeah, you do not need to go to extremely strict, gross foods to get healthy.
I love that you pointed that out.
You don't. And so the reason I tackled like what I would call like the grossest comfort foods is because, of course, ice cream is not a, quote, health food, but I will never give up ice cream. It is amazing. And there is a way to eat ice cream in moderation where without chemicals, without additives, without anything
It's both and.
Yes. And so
either or.
There is a way to do that. I love a great cheeseburger and fries. I love a great cheeseburger and fries. But when I have it, it'll be a grass-fed burger, probably with, we have like raw A2 cheddar in my house. We'll make a raw A2 cheddar cheeseburger and we'll beef tallow fry the fries. And it's epic.
It's better,
so you can eat epic things and you can balance it where you don't have to just eat like a raw vegan diet, which I would never advocate for.
What is the weirdest out of the box thing you've done for wellness that you're willing to admit on a podcast?
I've been a big fan of coffee enemas. Yeah,
I've heard that.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I've been a big fan of coffee enemas. That was part of my. I had mold poisoning a couple years ago, and that was part of my protocol.
Yeah,
and this is gonna be really funny. I'm sensitive to caffeine. I can't really drink coffee. I can have a little bit of matcha, but there's something about anal caffeine that's amazing.
It's a way to go.
Like if you could sell anal caffeine, like the way
that's going to be the title of this episode.
The way that it's a much slower burn. I would say coffee enemas I do probably once to twice a week. And you obviously have to know how to do it, and you have to do it with filtered water and all that stuff, and you don't want boiling water going up your ass. But like it's
we help people, we help patients out. We make it safe.
Yes.
Make it safe.
Yes, that would be the one that I'd say is definitely on the more weird
Cup of
side.
Joe on the other end. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. What's the place that you haven't been to travel wise that you want to visit? It's on your bucket list.
Galapagos.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm dying to go to Galapagos. Yeah. I'm a big fan of Darwin.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of ecosystems that are extremely different and unique. If you ever go to Hawaii has one of the most interesting ecosystems. Like the farther away islands are from land masses, the more interesting and bizarre the ecosystems are.
It's like a Garden of Eden, Avatar, Pandora.
So I would say Galapagos. I've always wanted to go to Easter Island, which has a lot of spiritual elements. I'm dying to go to ancient Egypt and the pyramids. I've been to Israel, which is incredible, but I haven't been to Egypt or Alexandria. Those would be in my probably top 3.
Do you like history? I posted when I was in Paris about the Merovingians, and you knew about the Merovingians. So how much do you like history?
I don't. I love what I'll call kind of mystical history.
Yeah, me too.
And like I spent a lot of time studying the Knights Templar.
Yeah.
And
I still need to watch that documentary.
Yeah, it's amazing. And what you realize, and when I started going through my spiritual awakening and started having my recognition that there is a lot of science to the mystical history. And like what most people don't know is that, for example, like George Washington was the Grand Master of the Knights Templar. And all of the greatest figures in American history, including, by the way, people like Da Vinci, were members of the Knights Templar. They were deeply spiritual. The founding fathers were very spiritual, and they believed in crazy...
Thomas Jefferson had a Zohar in his...
They believed in crazy, weird shit, including UAPs. And if you look at the back of the dollar bill, with the pyramid and the top of the pyramid is an eye, there is a lot of mystical items in the founding of the United States.
And people see that as like negative. It's not. These guys were really for freedom, self-governance of individuals.
Yeah, they were. Yeah. And the basis of democracy, which came originally from the ancient Greeks. And there's a great book that was written by a friend of mine called The Immortality Key.
I've read it before.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Which is about how they basically used psychedelics in
the cookie
in rites of passage for the leaders of society. And that a lot of their best ideas around democracy, around freedom of speech, that came from the spiritual connection in realizing how we need to live as humans. And they used it not as a way to do drugs. They used it as a way to broaden their perspectives. And I believe there are sources of information that are hard to explain where we receive them that guide us into these directions. And a lot of the human progress that we've made have come with these leaps that scientists can't explain. Like, how did we go from 10,000 years ago, we were like cavemen, to this, you know, and like, and by the way, we've been evolving as human beings for 300,000 years. The first Homo sapien was 300,000 years ago. And so like, it doesn't even make sense that we went like 290,000 years as like cavemen. And then just in the last like 5,000 years, we went from like building structures like the pyramids to like this. Like, it doesn't make any sense mathematically.
Yeah. What's somewhere you haven't, or no, that you've been to that's on your bucket list that's like more people should go to if they have the chance, travel-wise?
Jerusalem.
Yeah?
Jerusalem is one of the most amazing
talk about
places.
Mystical, spiritual stuff.
You feel the energy. And I took my daughter there 2 years ago for her bat mitzvah. And we had a university scholar who's a historian who was our tour guide, and knows like everything about the history of Israel. And we went to the Western Wall, which is considered the holiest place in the entire world, which was this giant wall that was basically the foundation of the second temple that in Jerusalem that was destroyed thousands of years ago. And he pointed, and this was before, like, my real spiritual awakening was really in the last 2 years. And he pointed up, like about 50 feet up on the wall. And he said, Jason, you see that block? And it was built out of these giant stone blocks. He's like, you see that block? I said, yeah. He said, that block is 1.2 million pounds in weight. And it's a single block that was put there. He said, we don't know today, with today's technology, how you can move a 1.2 million pound stone block up 50 feet on a wall. We don't have the technology today to put that up there. And he started encouraging me to look at all these ancient structures that we don't know how they built them, including the pyramids, by the way. And Jerusalem is filled with that kind of stuff. And it just makes you question, like, what were they doing 3,000 years ago to build that?
Yeah.
And it just broadens your mind on all of this stuff.
Oh man, I'm not saying this just to say this. Hands down, one of my favorite conversations on the pod. I knew it. I love your mind. Where do people go to learn about
HumanCo.com?
Yeah.
Is our website. My social handles is HumanCarp, K-A-R-P, one word, HumanCarp. I'm very active on Instagram, kind of active on X. Gonna have to get more active on X now.
That's right. That's right.
And yeah, I mean, obviously you and I are sharing a lot of content, and we'd love your listeners' support on how to boycott Kellogg's and get them to change their behavior, because if we can make an example out of Kellogg's and humiliate them because they've behaved in a really disgusting, corrupt way, it will set an example for other companies and will make other companies change their habits faster.
Yeah.
But we have to start somewhere, and that's why we pick Kellogg's to start.
Yeah. Well said. Thanks, my friend.
Thank you.